Okay, do you all need hand signals from me, or do you want to keep your own time?
I think hand signals wouldn't be too bad.
Okay. So do you just want to know when you have like a minute left, or what's going on?
4, 3, 2, 1.
Are you serious?
If that's okay.
Is everybody willing to keep their? If not, that's
I mean,
fine.
I can keep
I was
it.
gonna
Yeah, I'll
say,
try
can
to
you
do the
tell
best
us
of that
when
because
we're
I gotta
cut
like
off?
take notes as well. But
Whatever,
like,
whatever works for you.
but yeah, I'll do that. So every minute you want to know what's going on. That's cool. Just before you speak, if you can give me your name because I have to write it down on the rubric. I don't know any of you actually. And then we'll be good. Cool. All right. So we're gonna get a timer out. And okay, what is your name?
Rebecca Bearden.
Okay, Rebecca. I can just say my name is Louis Petit. I'm a professor in the department. I work with the debate team, so now you all know me. It's going to be a fun debate. Whenever you're set, Rebecca.
This House affirms the resolve, the U.S. federal government should increase regulations on CRISPR technology. This House argues that such regulations on CRISPR will allow for safe, ethical progress in future research and application, as well as mitigate concerns on current CRISPR research and applications. Both supporters and opponents of CRISPR technology application would benefit from increased regulations. CRISPR-Cas9 technology is currently the latest, most cost-efficient, and most precise method of genetic engineering. Clustered regularly interspaced palindromic repeats, or CRISPR technology, uses an enzyme called Cas9 to cut strands of DNA at precisely targeted locations. CRISPR is different from previous methods of genetic engineering because the Cas9 enzyme has the ability to precisely guide recombinant DNA, which provides the cutting feature. This House recognizes the FDA definition of genetic engineering, certain methods that scientists use to introduce new traits or characteristics to an organism, whereas genome editing is a term used to describe a relatively new set of technologies that enable one to make precise changes in the DNA of a plant, animal, or organism. This House follows the Merriam-Webster definition of regulations as an authoritative rule dealing with details or procedures. We define these regulations to be implemented by executive branch departments and agencies, such as the USDA, the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the FDA, as well as the EPA. However, this House proposes such regulating bodies must involve input from appropriate committee, board, or panel of experts across disciplines. We define substantial as considerable importance or work. For our debate, we state any increase would be a substantial increase. The second International Summit on Human Genome Editing is currently taking place in Hong Kong. Following the recent news of China's gene-edited babies, it is an understatement to say CRISPR technology is a relevant and significant topic of interest to many. CRISPR research and applications are already taking place. Though there are numerous benefits of applying CRISPR technology, there are also many concerns for CRISPR regulation. The current agencies and regulating bodies do not have harmonized regulations. The U.S. currently forbids genetically modified offspring. However, in the food and drug area, CRISPR technology is already being used. There are loopholes and gaps in the current regulations set by the FDA and the Department of Agriculture. Arthur Kaplan, the founding director of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU, summarizes these loopholes. In the USDA, the coordinated framework under the purview of USDA, the FDA, and the EPA provides guidance on agricultural applications of genome editing, but their regulations only cover plant pests, whereas applications of CRISPR that do not use plant pests or pest parts to introduce genetic edits fall outside of current regulations. Due to the current lack of adequate regulations and significance of the CRISPR controversy, this House argues increased regulations would be beneficial for two reasons. First, increased regulations for CRISPR technology address both sides of the controversy surrounding genetic engineering and genome editing. Those who oppose CRISPR tech fear potential consequences of rampant application. To address the concerns of CRISPR opposers, the U.S. government and an appropriate committee, panel, or board can implement parameters and requirements for research. Those who support CRISPR technology, who hope to see progress, would also benefit from regulations. Including relevant experts and scholars in the formation of regulations allows researchers to advance scientific knowledge with decreased controversy and decreased societal backlash. Both sides of the controversy would benefit from increased regulations. Second, implementing more CRISPR regulations will allow for safe and ethical progress. Continued CRISPR research is necessary for thorough scientific understanding of CRISPR and responsible application. In 2015, the founding director of medical ethics at NYU, Kaplan, said, "Given that CRISPR is cheap, easy to use, and does not require significant, sophisticated equipment or expert know-how, it has become a popular technology worldwide, which will eventually require international standards for testing genetically edited organisms, releasing them into the environment, and assigning liability for damage. The time to require these standards is now. CRISPR regulations are necessary for scientists to fully examine beneficial applications of CRISPR, responsible consequences of CRISPR, and how to deal with potential consequences in a safe and ethical way. In conclusion, the U.S. government should substantially increase regulations on CRISPR technology because both supporters and opponents of CRISPR technology would benefit from increased regulations. The advantages and disadvantages of CRISPR technology must be studied prior to increased and widespread application. And finally, regulations would allow for safe and ethical progress in both research and application."
All right. First, negative speaker.
Natalie Parsley.
How do you spell your last name, Natalie?
Parsley.
All right.
Technology has arrived that can prevent needless suffering and death. A technology that can prevent new parents from watching in horror as their child deteriorates from genetic complications. I'm speaking, of course, of the revolutionary medicine known as CRISPR and in turn Cas9. I am here to negate the proposed change to increase regulation on CRISPR. The possibilities of this technology are endless, but it is necessary to address specific outcome that reaches the edge of ethicality. Designer babies. When most people hear those two words, they automatically think about looks. Although when discussing the use of CRISPR, the revolution of gene modification represents so much more than just the physical appearance of a human being. Gene modification can change health in America and better yet, the entire world. It significantly decreases disease and birth defects in our children. As most people have been fortunate to be born healthy without any life-threatening conditions, there are so many that have not been so lucky. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, there are approximately 120,000 children born with a life-threatening condition or defect each year. This makes us wonder, why would we deprive children and families of something that could completely alter these numbers for future generations? These mothers and fathers would do anything to save their children, and it is hard to understand if you have not experienced this personally. This brings me to my next point, which is ethics. Many will argue that this is morally and ethically wrong to genetically modify a child, although in reality it could be even more unethical to keep such an advanced science and medicine away from the public. Think to yourself, if a cure for cancer was discovered, wouldn't it be unethical to keep this away from the public? This goes for CRISPR as well, because it can prevent many genetic and hereditary disorders before they even start, and taking this away from children and families would be an injustice to millions around the world. My team and I will be discussing the many ways that CRISPR is going to prevent millions of deaths for children across the world and why we as a society should fight against limitations on science and healing capabilities for our children. Finally, my hope for the audience today is to think about the future rather than present how one day CRISPR could even save your child's life or someone you love. Now, before I end, I would like to clarify a couple things. CRISPR, or Cas9, is a unique technology that enables genetics and medical researchers to edit parts of a genome by removing, adding, or altering of the DNA sequence. It is currently the simplest, most versatile, and precise method of genetic manipulation. And then we go into somatic CRISPR editing. After birth, relating to the body, especially as distinct from the mind, and then prenatal, a series of germ cells, each descended or developed from earlier cells in the series, regarded as continued through successive generations of an organism, and that is somatic and prenatal.
Sweet. Get to cross the examination now. Pretty sure. Yeah, 2 minutes between you speakers. You can begin whenever.
So you make the point of why would we deprive children and families of a technology that could potentially benefit them, help eradicate diseases and such. Do you think it is ethical to implement processes that we're not confident about in terms of long-term effect?
I believe with the right research, which is currently being done, absolutely. I do have a question for you, though. So you said in your statement that CRISPR is the most cost-effective and most useful in everything. So And please explain to me why you think that that's a negative towards.
Sure, I would love to. I don't think it's a negative. So to be clear, this House does not oppose CRISPR-Cas9 technology, research, or application. We want to recognize both the possible benefits, the advantages, and the disadvantages, which is why we need such regulations, because government regulations for CRISPR technology is necessary due to the controversial climate and the fact that there are so many potential benefits, but there are also so many potential consequences that we don't fully understand. We need regulations for research so that we can fully examine these consequences and benefits ethically and in a safe manner.
Now, when you say regulation, what type of regulations are you guys presenting?
As I mentioned, we propose that the regulating bodies in charge of the processes, so in the executive branch, the departments such as the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the FDA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, works in conjunction with a panel, a board, a field of experts across disciplines, such as biologists, ecologists, pharmacists, and includes scientific input as well as policymaker input as to how best formulate the regulations.
Okay. So you brought up to the point of the case that had recently occurred in China.
Yeah. That's just my regular 1116 alarm. Okay, so the second affirmative, or second speaker, the rebuttal. What's your name?
Christopher Willis, Jr.
All right, Christopher, whenever you're ready.
This House would like to refute the claim that the U.S. should not increase regulations. The U.S. federal government should increase regulations on CRISPR technology. Both supporters and opponents of CRISPR technology would benefit from increased regulations. The advantages and disadvantages of CRISPR technology must be studied prior to increased/widespread application. In addition, regulations would allow for safe, ethical progress in both research and application. The negative stated that why would we hold this technology from the people who really need it? To completely reassure the public that it is safe technology that we're going to be introducing out into the community for when you have gene modifications into your babies to get rid of diseases and stuff. We also want to ensure that there are contingency plans in place that once these are released out into the public, there are plans to make sure that if there is anything wrong in further generations, we can fix that. Claims that it's ethical to give the public claims that it's ethical for the public to receive these benefits. It's unethical to not have a contingency plan in place to fix the consequences that will be put into place in generations down the line from these gene edits in the society and population. Furthermore, they claim that as precise as the technology is, how are you observing these effects after implemented into society? Where is the preciseness of long-term effects and further generations that are unseen by the current application of CRISPR now? For instance, one great risk in the introduction of alleles with the unintended side effects can be put into those populations, and currently a harmful gene edit cannot be removed from population once introduced into the germline. Until we develop the technology to remove the deleterious edits, we should not accelerate the pace at which edits can spread. This is what we argue for when we say we need increased regulations. Regulatory parsimony is a substantial increase, so all we offer is that there should be a regulatory amount that can proceed in ethical and safe and diligent progress into CRISPR-Cas9 technology, and that there will be safe implications when this is going in. In addition, we agree with scholars Goodman and Marino when they state that government should follow the principle of regulatory parsimony, which dictates that they should impose only those restrictions necessary to maintain ethical standards and public safety. And
So who is the second negative speaker?
That's me. My name is Brandon Carruthers.
Can you spell your last name?
Carithers.
That's close. Whatever you're saying.
All right. I'm here to negate that the increase or substantial increase on regulations on CRISPR technology because of, they talk about these benefits from increased regulations, but where are these benefits now? They've already begun CRISPR testing on embryos as we speak. And that's just like in the case in China, where they already have 2 twin embryos who've already been CRISPR'd already to prevent further HIV spread in their gene line. They talk about the agricultural benefits, but these are very insignificant towards what we're talking about is which is human benefits for CRISPR. The human applications for CRISPR are numerous, and the consequences of not using this technology on our own people are vast. The adverse effects that CRISPR might have are insignificant compared to the hundreds of mutations that are introduced into our own gene pool with every new generation. The ethical point, the ethical problem with ethics is that is it ethical to withhold this technology from our people, or is it ethical to let the research go on while the people are suffering from their deformities that we could have solved now, just as in the case in China? Now, they talk about substantially increasing these regulations, but these regulations did not stop people from already testing this on these embryos, and it would in fact it would lead to further testing that would be unethical and go against many national laws that we already have in place, leading to further loss of life and increased gene pool corruption. They also argue about public safety and having backup plans for in case of CRISPR use now. But these plans, how did they stop this professor in China from doing what he's done already?
Oh, there's a grand crossfire for 2 minutes
We have
between those two
one.
speakers.
Oh, sorry.
You want to do what?
You said Grand Crossfire?
Well, it's between these two speakers. Not all of them. That's in a little bit.
Yeah. So you brought up the case of the scientists in China that were introduced to 2 twin babies that have been genetically modified. It is a fraudulent ethical review material that allowed him to do these gene edits in the first place. In addition, he has not released any assertions of his own work currently to the scientific community about how he did this. In addition, that allowed one scientist to go against the scientific community to do his own research. Therefore, this is the case of one, not many. So these regulations will apply to all. Only one scientist decided to go against that. Furthermore, do you not agree that it's unethical to introduce this technology without reversal strategies in place to the public, just in case a delirious edit does happen further down their generations?
Now, you said it's just one scientist going against the regulations. wouldn't your regulations have been able to stop him or have put into place some sort of committee that was oversight on this to prevent this?
Laws are put into place constantly, and there are also people that go against those laws. Does not mean that law in place is not for the betterment of the community. Just because we look at the case of one researcher does not mean that applies to all researchers. That is a hasty generalization to assume that one researcher is going to be all the researchers in the scientific community when it comes to CRISPR-Cas9 technology and doing embryonic research on them when it comes to this. These regulations will allow for the scientists who do follow laws to safely, ethically, and diligently come up with new CRISPR-Cas9 technology and ways for it to be reversed further down lines with deleterious edits or mosaic cells that get out of control when reproduced.
And how would your regulations deal with a case as in now where he's already done it? How would you stop this?
Since it's already been done, it can't be
That's
stopped.
the time. I don't know why we're going to go.
Thank you.
All right. These speeches are 4 minutes. According to this rubric. Your name.
Emily Smith.
All right, Emily, whenever you're ready.
Okay, my opponents state that CRISPR prevents disease and birth defects, and they ask us why would we deprive people of a cure. But we say we believe CRISPR is good. We recognize the benefits and the amazing things it could do for people who suffer from diseases, but there are definitely drawbacks. Furthermore, you guys state that we're just talking about human benefits and that agricultural implications are insignificant, but that's completely false. For example, according to Amy Gutman and Jonathan D. Moreno, researchers are working to develop a house mouse that can give birth to only male offspring. If the altered mice were released into the wild, female mice would gradually disappear and the species would die off within the area in which the altered mice were introduced. This, of course, is an animal application, but we don't know the ecological consequences that could come from this. Without regulations, or with regulations in place, we could impose backup plans and regulations that would help us correct these consequences if they ever do happen. Also, the fact that we already have begun to research shows that we are in desperate need, urgent need of regulations right now because we don't know what these kinds of what these researchers are working on and what are the consequences that they can have. You also ask, is it ethical to withhold technology from the people that are suffering now? But is it ethical to test without a plan if something goes wrong? If we just continue to work without regulations in place, we won't be able to have backup plans and be able to correct the human race, the agricultural industry, and other species that are being tested on if we don't impose regulations. Also, you say that CRISPR is so important to people with diseases, but CRISPR technology right now is so, it's so in a certain place, like you can't really, like in China, like that country has funding and things like that, but where people are truly suffering from disease, such as in Africa with HIV, they won't be able to afford the CRISPR technology, and so how can you say that this is actually going to help without regulations? It's from Antonio Regaldo, editing embryos during an IVF procedure would be costly, high-tech, and likely to remain inaccessible in poor regions of the world where HIV is rampant. And with these regulations in place, we can ensure that the progress that we're making is ethical and safe, and eventually this CRISPR technology would get to those areas and would be able to help the people, the mass amounts of people in regions of Africa that are suffering from HIV. And as my teammate said, you said laws don't stop the people who break the laws, but does that mean we shouldn't have laws at all? Oh, yeah, I received my time.
All right. Your name.
Travis Clark.
Okay, Travis, whenever you're ready.
So my opponents mentioned that the the regulations would address both sides. That would be people who are against CRISPR technology to delay more time for them to eventually come around to it, is what it sounded like. But we argue that regulations would slow down that progress that scientists are working on now. That slowdown would therefore make those people who are suffering from diseases that CRISPR technology could solve, anything like birth defects, anything like that, it would shortchange them by slowing down this technology, because if you slow down something, it's not going to reach a certain amount of people, right? So if you say, okay, CRISPR technology is going to take 5 years to kick in, well then those people affected in those 5 years, they won't be able to be helped. And so how are you going to talk about ethics when we're talking about you're taking away this opportunity for these people? These regulations would slow this down. Again, it was mentioned that you said it was expensive, but there's a man right now that we did research on that sells CRISPR kits for $112 in the U.S., and you can CRISPR yourself. You can literally, it's experimental, but it's there. And so this experimentation is not as expensive as the opposition has presented it. Iverson.
I think this is Grand Crossfire, all right?
Yep.
All right. 3 minutes. Go for it.
This is for the entire, this isn't specific, but do you think that slowed responsible progress is less beneficial than rampant unregulated process?
I would argue that the rampant unregulated process would allow for a greater use of experimentation time. Using an unregulated body that allows for more innovation. See the example within capitalism and government regulation within business. You could also argue that increased regulation within a body, such as the United States, would send such even worse, and you argue the consequences for a conditional experimentation that's sending that to a place where we would not even have a hand in deciding what kind of fate genome editing would happen.
To address that, we merely meant, yes, CRISPR is the most cost efficient. However, right now, one of the main benefits of CRISPR being eradicating diseases can't actually be applied everywhere. Yes, we would not have regulation over how they use it. However, we can regulate where we go with our research and our current applications so that then we better understand how it can be implemented there. You say that this slows up, the regulations would be slowing the progress and many people wouldn't be able to be helped. But I argue, would we really be helping them if we are applying therapeutic processes that we don't know the full consequences of? Sure, we can argue, you could argue that doing so would allow us to study it, but is it ethical to put in place applications that we don't know the full consequences of and claim that we're helping them, that we're going to eradicate X, Y, and Z when we honestly don't know?
You say unintended consequences, but wouldn't any unintended consequences within the actual DNA sequence cause the being to be like unviable, so that it's understanding that if something failed, or the unintended consequences, as it were, would simply, like, in a sense, fizzle out with that subject.
So are you arguing that we should be doing this to embryos that will become humans? Because right now that's illegal.
That's a great point. It's illegal in the United States.
Yes. Which is what we're covering as of right now.
Exactly, but there's two different sides, as mentioned in our opening presentation, between somatic editing and then
Yes.
germline editing.
Yes.
Somatic editing can be after the subject has been formed. For example, the man who sells kits to CRISPR yourself, he actually fixed his IBS symptoms by CRISPRing himself.
Sure, and I'd like to talk to him later on to see what else has come of that.
Sure thing.
See, in somatic, yes, we can implement it, and there will be long-term consequences that we won't know until we get there. Germline, not so much, but somatic, yes.
All right, time. So, fourth affirmative speaker, 4 minutes.
My name is Robert Digler, Bigler.
All right, Robert.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate for our audience and for our opposition that we are not opposed to the innovation of CRISPR technology. In fact, we are in favor of the use of this technology used, controlled, and regulated. What we oppose is the potential for abuse of this technology that exists under the current regulation of genetic modification. As it stands, and as we've stated, the current regulations on GMO technology apply to additive processes of genetic modification. Basically, under the regulations of GMOs, the way we are currently regulating the processes are additive. If you add into the genetics of the cell, then the current regulations exist. However, in subtractive processes, there's this huge loophole that exists that I don't think has gone addressed. Basically, using CRISPR, you remove genetic information from the cell, and the current regulations that exist under the FDA do not remove, do not apply to this new technology. Furthermore, I think there have been several points that have gone unaddressed. Points that we've noticed are future germline and other consequences. Basically, the idea of germline technology is when you've adapted the genetics of an organism, and that organism reproduces once, twice, several times down the line, it produces further genetic modification. That's how mutation works. And so, we have not addressed what any kind of plan for what would happen if some consequence presents itself 2, 3 generations down the line. And I think that's a critical point in this. When we're talking about ethics, yes, okay, we've got people that need attention right now. I agree. But I think the best that we can do for people, the best we can do for creatures, the best we can do for the world right now is to handle this situation responsibly the way we have with other technology. You know, we've got this historical precedent of careful, ethical, scientific research in progress that dictates that one should handle things safely in the lab before releasing it to the public. I do not agree with this man that's using CRISPR technology on himself. I think it's ridiculous to think that one should be even allowed to do wild research on oneself before it's been tested in the lab setting, because we can't predict the future repercussions of this situation. The germline reproductive cycle is this major wave of effect that has gone unaddressed, and I think it's vitally important to this discussion. Points that we brought up that I think went rather unaddressed were the agricultural and ecological benefits of safe implementation of this technology. I think given the regulation, putting it into testing in a scientific setting where we can measure the 1, 2, 3 steps down the line technology, I think this can be a huge innovation for mankind. But again, I would just like to reiterate for the audience, for our opposition, that we do not call for the detriment, to do away with this technology. All we're calling for is for safely and securely regulated implementation of the technology in the United States for the betterment of ourselves, for the betterment of our environment, and for the betterment of mankind. Thank you. I received my time.
All right. Your name.
Jeff Young.
All right, Jeff, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Opposing counsel suggests that they do not, in fact, want to get rid of such CRISPR technology. Now, they only want to have mere oversight over it within a governmental body. Now, second speaker suggested the different scholars with oversight within the FDA, the EPA, and so on. However, wouldn't it be necessary to understand that those private scholars worked within the private sector at one point and not leave them to have their own regulating situation within their experimentation? Now, fourth speaker introduced an interesting point about individual liberties of not allowing to experiment on oneself or so do anything to one's own body. And while no, this is not a constitutional discussion, I would have to introduce the idea of what it would mean under that sort of precedent of what you can and cannot do for yourself within your own home. Now, sure. You mentioned, second speaker, how the Chinese have funding. We've mentioned previously how CRISPR editing is not a very expensive process, and along with the unintended consequences, a regulative body to understand exactly what's happening between each generation would, in effect, last generations, as it were. I would also like to mention the precedent set under what it would mean to regulate this body. I did mention in the Grand Crossfire how further regulation and indeed reduced experimentation due to regulation would send it to elsewhere, so sort of China or any other country that does not have such regulations. Again, to use the example of capitalism, we have that in American business, in American clothing industries, with sweatshops and places with horrible humanitarian crises. So it would be, in effect, irresponsible to regulate such a system that can help, whereas the regulation itself would be, in effect, damning to the whole institution. I neglected to hear any exact regulation other than just oversight, which is fine, but it lacks the sort of substance that would be used to really define why a governmental body should regulate CRISPR other than unintended consequences. Yeah, I received my time.
Good job, everyone. All right, so I think that concludes the debate. All right? All right, great job.
Good job, you guys.
Stop your camera.
Good job. Good job.